Hi, everybody. Welcome to a wonderful podcast that we're going to have today. It's a real treat um, to welcome Antonio Vecchio, the Community and Consumer Engagement Manager from the Spinal Research Institute in Australia, and Associate Professor Heather Gainforth, the Principal Investigator on the Integrated Knowledge Translation Guiding Principles Partnership from the University of British Columbia. And my name is Dr. Johnny Bourke, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the John Moss Centre for Rehabilitation Research at the University of Sydney. And it's early in the morning here. I think, Heather, for you, maybe it's midday over there.
Yes, lunchtime.
Wonderful. Good morning, Antonio. You're up early like me?
Yes, Johnny, early like you. We're in the same time zone, so
Fantastic. So today we're going to talk about all things co-design. Hopefully, everyone who's listening or will listen to this will have some really cool tips and a bit of extra knowledge once I've finished listening to our chat today. But I think to start things off randomly and to set the tone, I'm going to ask both Heather and Antonio, pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
you go first,
And
Heather.
I think you're gonna make me go first. Okay. Well, absolutely yes. As a Canadian, the Hawaiian pizza of pineapple and ham on pizza apparently was, I looked this up. I knew you were gonna ask me this. So apparently this was invented in Canada and it's called Hawaiian pizza because it was the brand of the pineapple that the inventor used. And so I feel like as a proud Canadian, you have to accept pineapple on pizza. And we'll see if Antonia and I are still friends.
Yes, well, Heather, if you had have pointed it out about 10 years ago, the friendship would be questionable. I've mellowed in older age, accepting that there are people in this world that have pineapple on pizza, even though I think it is reprehensible in some cases. But if it's a dessert pizza, maybe, but yeah, other than that,
Uh,
but I've
Is that
definitely
your Italian heritage, Antonio?
it is my Italian heritage. Like, oh God, it's pineapple on pizza. And you're right, it is a North American thing. So
Mm.
We definitely
Like I,
reinvented something. What about you, Johnny?
well, yeah, I was thinking about this, and I was kind of, to be honest, yeah, I'm a fan of pineapple on pizza. Um, it's interesting to learn that it's from Canada. I always thought it was maybe a New Zealand thing or an Australian thing, but there we have it.
I
Um,
haven't
yeah,
thought
and
of
we
it.
won't start on whether we should put pineapple on hamburgers. That's maybe a conversation for
Oh,
another day.
I hadn't even thought about that one, but now I'm
Yeah,
intrigued.
yeah, I
I'm
thought I'd throw that
intrigued.
out there just to whet your appetite, literally. Okay, so all things co-design. That's enough talk about food. Um, so I thought to start things off, Heather, I might throw it over to you first. Would you do us the honor of just introducing in a bit more detail who you are, where you work, and essentially why co-design matters to you?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Heather Gainforth, as you mentioned, and I work on the beautiful and traditional and unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation, and that is based in the interior of British Columbia. And I work for the University of British Columbia. We have multiple campuses, so I'm in the one in the beautiful Okanagan. Please come visit us; it's gorgeous. It's a really beautiful place to work and to learn. And my roles here is I'm an associate professor in our School of Health and Exercise Sciences, and then I have a few other hats. I'm the director of the Center for Health Behavior Change. We do a lot of work within for people with SCI in intervention research. And then I'm also the associate director of meaningful engagement at ICORD, so the International Collaboration on Repair Discoveries. Um, I'm really proud to have that role, as it's the first time we've had a role in meaningful engagement at ICORD, and I have the pleasure of leading our engagement team. And then probably where people know me maybe more from is that I also have the pleasure of leading the Integrated Knowledge Translation Guiding Principles Partnership. So I've helped and been able to lead that group to do the background work to develop the guiding principles, and then continue to lead that team to be able to think about how we implement the principles in practice and change the way funding works, the way research works, and also how we support knowledge users and partners to be able to come to the table. And that's been incredibly rewarding. And so with that, why does co-design matter to me? I was so lucky to have done my PhD in partnership with Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. I did my PhD at Queen's University, and Ontario is a province in Canada, so our provincial organization there. And from the day I started my PhD, it was done in partnership with SCI Ontario, and leaders at SCI Ontario essentially said to me, there's nothing about us without us, and we will be doing your partnership or your PhD in partnership. And now, many years later, I recognize what a privilege that was, to essentially not be taught another way of doing research. And over time, as my career kind of progressed, I thought that I would be doing intervention research with and for people with spinal cord injury, as a behavioral scientist. But why co-design matters to me is in 2016, I was asked by several partners, if you're such a great behavioral scientist, can you change the researchers' behaviors? And they told me stories of tokenism. They told me stories of how frustrating the spinal cord injury research system had been for them. And I think when you get asked a question like that in your career, how do you not listen, and how do you not change your research program to use the knowledge and the privilege you have to serve people? And so it's probably the ultimate question that comes from a research partner, and that's completely shifted my career over the last 10 years. I'm not just someone that does engaged research. I'm also somebody that studies it.
Fantastic. And I'm lucky enough to be working on a research project with you, Heather, so I know your dedication and to all things co-design and partnership. Antonio, I might just throw the same questions over to you now. Kind of what you do on a more day-to-day basis, and we're going to dive into what is co-design and how we do it well further down the track, but just why co-design matters to you, Antonio, and what brought you to this space.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. I sort of fell into this space, to be honest. I studied, a bit like Heather, behavior science, psychological science, and I was working in the community, really away from spinal for a long period of time. It wasn't necessarily on my radar to work in spinal. I'd done many different things until I joined the SRI, and a lot in mental health, a lot in the community, and even in sport. So I guess I don't come from this with a academic per se background, even a
You have the
clinical.
lived experience.
Yeah. So, but also, that I have that lived experience of spinal cord injury. So I sort of fell into this job. It was a good opportunity at the time. To become, the community and consumer engagement manager at the SRI. And for those of you unfamiliar with the SRI, Spinal Research Institute, a lot of what we do is around collaboration. So for many years, it was around collaboration, researchers working with researchers globally. And the next evolution of that was getting people with lived experience involved. So we'd build up structures on how to get researchers working together. And then it's just that natural evolution, and part of that is obviously higher expectations on researchers to involve people with lived experience, or consumers, let's say, and we can do a deep dive on that term later. But for me, it's just that natural progression of, Heather used the term, no decision about me without me. It's that practical element of co-design. Now, I focus a lot on engagement, and co-design is one part of engagement. So it's not the start, it's not the end, it's one part. And for me, having that co-design involvement as part of the engagement process in research is a big role for me. One, you get that lived experience point of view, but you also get interaction. So, that's the big thing for me of co-design. You actually get that interaction. So people with lived experience learn about research and the processes and the value of research, but also researchers then learn how to how to develop their own co-design strategies, but then incorporate that into their work, and they build real relationships. And that relationship side of co-design, I think, is really important.
Fantastic. Um, yeah, well I know I have the privilege of working with you both in this space. So I know some of the wonderful projects you both work in. And like I was saying to you, Heather, before, some of the intent behind a lot of your work and motivation for it. Um, my introduction to co-design came a number of years ago. I have the lived experience of spinal cord injury, but I also studied to a PhD, which I graduated with quite a long time ago now, somewhere around 2017. But I am from New Zealand, but I was working for an organization called the Build Academy of Independent Living. And a big part of our approach was to try and include people with lived experience in the research process. And we tried to do that through a number of different ways, whether it was assembling a group, essentially a mailing list, and we'd send out summarized versions of research proposals to get their feedback on it, or whether it was employing people as research assistants who had the lived experience, or helping people get into tertiary education if they could. But I'd like to kind of go into a bit more detail about what co-design is and try and keep the conversation practical. So if researchers are listening to this podcast or people with lived experience are listening, just kind of in plain language what you think co-design is and maybe what it is not. Antonio, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, so I think for me, it is an interesting question because um, definitely in Australia, and from what I've noticed globally, co-design, it's embedded in everything we say, and it's sort of, you know, I don't necessarily like calling it a buzzword, but it has become a word that gets used a lot. So that can take away from what it is and what it isn't. In my opinion, what co-design is, in its simplest form, is, when you have a project that influences people, having the people that it influences helping actually create and design the process, as well as informing the process. So the way I look at um, co-design, it's okay. And something that comes up in a lot of conversation that, well, is it true co-design if the person from lived experience wasn't involved in the original thought bubble, but someone needs to have that thought bubble initially, and it's then bringing people in, and sort of, and Heather and Johnny, as more active researchers than I am, you may get this, that you may think something is a good idea. You've had that initial thought bubble, but then you've been steered away or been refined, let's say. So to me, that's what co-design is. It's really the process of somebody's had a thought bubble and then using real world experience to refine that, and then develop a methodology, and then create outcomes based off that refinement.
Fantastic. Heather.
Yeah, I think Johnny, you've hit on lots of pieces that align with my thinking, especially the piece around, is it co-design? Is it not co-design? Is it integrated KT? Is it co-production? Is it co-development? There's
Yeah.
so many co-words in the space that sometimes I think we get a bit caught in the maybe riffraff of that all, to the point that I've read a paper that talks about that it should be called cobiquity. I'm like, what?
Yeah,
Just put a
yeah.
comma in front of it. And what does that actually mean? And that sort of shifted me a lot to think about the practice of co-design or the practice of integrated KT, really thinking about what would it look like if I'm doing it, because often people too will tell you they're doing co-design and then you ask them what they did and you're like, I can't actually see where it is. And so really asking people what they do. So when I'm like listening for co-design or listening to what people are telling me, and number one, I'm looking for meaningful engagement of knowledge users, people that will be benefiting, affected, influenced by the work. Have they been engaged ideally early and often? And then do they have in that engagement, do they have both representation? So people tell me I worked with XYZ groups, but more so, do they have agency? So I'm listening for where does that person's representation on the partnership actually influence decision making or how things are done? So Antonio hit on that perfectly, right? Like, did they have any influence over the question? Was it something that was negotiated? What about the methods? Did they have the opportunity to discuss the methods? Did they have an opportunity to suggest changes or even agree that it is the right method? And then also I kind of think about, do they have agency over their level of engagement? So sometimes I think we get quite prescriptive about co-design where we say it has to look one way. And I worry about that too, because then you're actually taking away someone's agency. So do they also have agency in their engagement? And that kind of aligns with our definition from the integrated knowledge translation guiding principles work that we've done, where we say that it's the meaningful engagement of the right research users at the right time. And more so, I think about that as like, and at the right level of engagement. So it's kind of how I think about it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think you guys have really hit on something there. And I know some of the work that we do at the John Walsh Centre for Rehabilitation Research at the University of Sydney, when we're trying to make sure we do co-design or communicate co-design, it's essentially like what you said there, Heather. Do people have a chance to influence the research design, the methodology? And there's various ways they can do that. A lot of people, if they know anything about co-design, will kind of know that spectrum. So you have at one end, for example, just um, kind of run-of-the-mill consultation. They might be reviewing material design, and it might be kind of like a one-off feedback kind of approach. Where at the other end of the spectrum, you've got full-blown partnership. So people will be equal in the power sharing of a project. And then you've got various ways in between there. So it might be, for example, two feedback mechanisms, or people might have repeated chances. But quite a common one, I think, is quite a good approach, and it'll be interesting to get your guys' thoughts on this. It's kind of like having a lived experience or a consumer advisory committee, but that they actually have teeth, so to speak. They actually can change the research project or guide the research project in a different direction. And I think, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this, it's incumbent on the researcher, if they're doing co-design properly, to actually listen if change is required and actually make that change. Do you think that's sometimes where a sticky part of co-design comes, when researchers have to kind of challenge that traditional occupation of power that they might have?
I would agree with you, Johnny. Like the piece of co-design is that we share in decision making. In our principled approach, that is principle two, is partners share in decision making, and partners include researchers and our knowledge users. And in that, the share in decision making sometimes is very hard for people to wrap their head around, especially when they maybe have been trained or come from research systems where the scientist makes the decision and the scientist holds the power. in those decisions. And so as someone doing co-design, you have to do that reflective work of how are you sharing your power? And if the project doesn't look like what you thought it would look like at the beginning, that's a good outcome. That actually probably shows that you're doing co-design in a good way,
Right.
versus holding and saying, well, because of XYZ, this is the only way we can do it. And that kind of relates to thinking about whose knowledge is valid and whose knowledge matters. And so it requires a philosophical shift that research knowledge or knowledge that comes from a PhD is not the only form of knowledge, and that you have to value diverse expertise. And when you can value diverse expertise and see that there are expertise beyond yours as research expert that you are, then there's great value in sharing and decision making, because it means that you actually get a much more diverse perspective, and diverse input on your study. And ideally, that makes your research more relevant, more useful, more usable. But it does come back to being okay that the reason you're making your decision isn't just on your expertise alone or your field's expertise alone.
Fantastic. Yeah, I really like those points, Heather. Um, Antonio, um, you said before, you're not a bona fide researcher per se, but I think everything you bring to the table informs research, and it is so incredibly valuable. Um, can I ask you, kind of building on this conversation, from your observation, you've been in the quote unquote industry for a long time now and been around researchers. What are some of the misconceptions or dare I say it, mistakes that you often see people do with co-design, or what is co-design not? Perhaps that's a better way to frame it.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question. I will preface it. I have enough people say that I'm a quasi-academic, that I'm much more comfortable being a quote-unquote researcher than I was at the start. It's an interesting question, what it is and what it isn't. And I guess to Heather's point, getting the right, in Heather's work, with the Heather and her team's work on the IKT principles around identifying the right person at the right time to have maximum impact. So my observation is, and then I guess in my role, I've been lucky that, I work with researchers across the whole spectrum, so basic scientists all the way to people within the community. And the expectations of co-design are very similar for them, but their ability to actually implement co-design can be difficult. So, for example, a person who works in a lab, who is expected to have co-design, may have genuine intent to actually engage people with lived experience, but because they haven't necessarily worked clinically or worked, and I mentioned before about relationships. So, for example, a physiotherapist who may have worked 10 years in spinal cord injury then decides to go off and do a PhD and become a researcher, has trust within the people that they've worked with, has relationships. So, from a recruitment point of view, and getting people involved in their study, but they also have their own lived experience of being a clinician in spinal cord injury for many years, having had conversations with people in the community, which is a big thing compared to somebody that doesn't have access or direct access. I think, and I don't like using the word mistakes because it's a learning process, but I think something that I've observed is people and researchers love frameworks, and they love, step-by-step guides
I think
to,
that's pretty fair, would you say, Heather?
Yeah.
So, I'll engage with the researcher and they go, well, do you have just a one-page framework that I can use? They're like, no. But so my observation is, and my advice is always, so there are really good models. So the IKT principles that, Heather and her team develop, but I don't call them a framework. That's just a philosophy of how you can apply work, for example. So it's not, I have to tick this box, this box, this box. So my advice is always, and what makes good co-design, even if you've done co-design on a project in the past, is analyze the project that you're currently working on. So identify who informs your work, who's going to implement your work, and who is going to benefit from your work. Now, they may not always be people with lived experience, but there are people with lived experience with that. You mentioned steering committees, Johnny, before, and I'm really big on, if you're going to set up a steering committee, rather than having, and it's not always possible, and you can have separate steering committees, and Johnny, you and I are involved in projects where we have this, but actually bring the people together. But if you have a smaller project, actually set up your steering committee of, let's say you have 8 people on a steering committee, 4 or 5 people lived experience, and then a clinician or someone that's implementing or someone from market, because that is good co-design. You're actually having your steering committee create robust discussion within the committee, and that takes away the us and them. But my biggest advice is sort of focus on the project you're on, identify the opportunities within that project, because a steering committee might not be appropriate, but you may need someone for governance with lived experience. You may need other opportunities. So that's probably the biggest thing that I've observed in this space is the overwhelming need for a framework, but the actual practicality of implementing a framework doesn't always resonate.
Yeah, it's great advice, Antonio. It's really valuable. Heather, do you have anything to add to that? And then afterwards, we might start to get away from more of the kind of bigger ethical rationale for partnership and kind of look at some of the more practical day-to-day stuff that people can do. But in your experience, Heather, especially with the IKT principles, what do you think co-design is and is not if we try and hone a bit of a definition?
Yeah, great questions. Initially, I would think very aspirationally about IKT and all the ways, or co-design of all the ways I could do this really wonderfully. And I do still think very aspirationally. But more and more so, I've been thinking as bare minimums of, at minimum, what do I expect of myself? And
Nice.
what does the design look like for me? And I really look for, do I have representation and agency? Period. And then in that relationship, am I treating people with respect, dignity, transparency? Because I think if I can start from those 2 places, the rest can fall into place more easily. Versus I think it can be very overwhelming to say, even look at our 8 guiding principles and think about how does that fit? And I love Antonio's recommendation of look at one of your projects right now and consider how that fits. And that's actually something I do in my own partnerships all the time. So as Antonio states, the guiding principles are not necessarily a framework. The way I think about them is they are the head and the heart of what you do. They're how you think about your partnership, and they're how you want to show up with essentially love and care for the people you work with. And then that drives your behaviors and it drives all your practices. So none of my partnerships look exactly the same. They are all a little bit different. I would say the principles of them are the same, but the practices of them look a little bit different every time because people want different things. But I often use the principles in moments where my partnerships don't feel good, or we had a really tough meeting, or it feels like we're stuck. And I'll go back and look at that meeting against the principles and say, what fell apart here? Oh my gosh, principle 3, communications. Like it totally fell apart. I need to go back and re-communicate. Or what fell apart here? I absolutely wasn't as transparent as I could have been, or I didn't think about practical considerations around finances. I need to rethink about that. And so I find them helpful in almost doing this more reflective process throughout my partnership and over time. And that some days my partnership feels great and some days it needs more more tweaking and thought within it. So yeah, something to sort of build on that and consider as you start to consider maybe what co-design looks like.
If I may just add
Fantastic.
to
Yeah.
that,
Oh,
Johnny, if I may just add to that, part of that
Mhm.
question of what isn't co-design, I think in my mind, what isn't co-design, and sort of Heather sort of touches on it, of that self-reflection, what it isn't to me is being rigid in developing a process that I will apply to every project that I do. So that's, in my mind, not co-design. That's not actively seeking opportunities to develop relationships, build on existing relationships. That's more just well, this is a co-design process, I'm doing it, as opposed to actually, to Heather's point, really being thoughtful about what you're doing and um, understanding that you're not going to be perfect because it is relationships. Not all relationships um, go well. Like, sometimes there may be times that, a co-design relationship, even through and I never see it as a negative, even through a difference of opinion, may put pressure on that relationship. But those conversations are important.
Yeah, I think you guys have hit on a really good a theme there. That's a great segue, actually. And to just add to that from my experience, I was privileged about 2 years ago, or 2024, to do some work with some colleagues when we looked at uh, a principle-based approach from co-design to co-production. And essentially those principles were, the themes that you can have guiding your work, and they might look quite different for different projects. But essentially they were, sharing power, developing really good relationships between researchers and people with lived experience so that your relationships have that resilience to go through different projects. Um, but the one that you guys were kind of touching on there, and the third principle in our paper was just do the best with what you've got. Sometimes I talk to colleagues who are in the research space, and they're kind of almost too worried about not doing co-design authentically or properly that it becomes a barrier in itself. And I think just doing the best, if you go in with the right intentions and try your best, there's no such thing as the perfect co-design project, and you're always going to come away from any project with learnings or something. Oh, I'm going to try that differently next time. We tried to do our best there, but it didn't quite work out. But we had time pressure or funding pressure, or pressure to try and integrate different perspectives. So knowing that there's never the right thing, but that you go in with the right intent, I think is very valuable. And I think to build on that now, if we could look at some real practical ways, maybe people who might be listening and thinking, yeah, I want to do a co-design project, I want to integrate this into my work. What are a couple of takeaways or just practical points people could do, like in the short term future in their projects? Um, Heather, might start with you this time.
yeah. I think the first piece to thinking about co-design is actually spending some time thinking about yourself, and your experiences and um, your privilege and your positionality in the space. I do think when you show up into these relationships, as Antonio mentioned, these are relationships. So what expertise are you bringing? What privilege are you bringing? How are you going to navigate that? So that you value diverse voices. I think it's really important that when we partner, we aim to support a safe and welcoming and inclusive environment for everyone. And that does require us to do our own personal work. So spending some time on that, not to the point where it scares you to approach things, because you can always apologize and make amends, but with thinking about yourself, and then thinking about your principles and your relational approach. I think it's really important as a as a bare minimum to have some form of principles. And the IKT guiding principles are one example, but as Johnny mentioned, there are many other principles too. There's principles related to community-based participatory research. There's different values that you might actually want to work on as a team. Whatever approach you take, I think it's important to take the time to get clear on those, because what those do is define what's okay and what's not okay. And they help you in these challenging times when things are not going so well. So essentially, what they do is almost write your prenup, and you want to write a prenup when everybody's still in love.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
right? Like write your
Uh,
prenup then, and then it guides you, right? On those hard moments of like, this meeting's not going well, or I don't know if I should ask Antonio about X. Well, based on this, I should, or based on this, I shouldn't because it'll cross something else. So I think
yeah,
that becomes really important. And then
yeah,
really thinking about who uses my research, and how can I engage them early and often. And I've said to people who they'll say to me, well, the main people that use my research are other researchers. And I would hope that you also take a principled and relational approach when you engage with other researchers too. I hope that
yeah,
you treat them with respect and dignity. I hope that you share in decision making with them. I hope that you think about financial constraints and you value their expertise. So regardless of even if it's quote co-design, if you are working with anyone other than you, what is your principled approach to engagement? Because anyone else
yeah,
on your team should be
yeah.
treated with respect and dignity.
That's fantastic, Heather. And before I throw over to you, Antonio, I think that's one of the big takeaways for co-design research too, for those listening. It's about building relationships, and that lived experience is not just necessarily people who have a spinal cord injury, but lived experience, like Antonio was alluding to before. Lived experience can be the lived experience of being a clinician, on a spinal rehabilitation unit, or lived experience could be as a researcher or someone working in the community. It's kind of relative, but I think building relationships is really, really important. So, consider where you're working, the context, the country, the environment that you're working in. Who are the lived experience organizations in your space, and how can you actually reach out? You say, look, I'm not actually doing a research project at the moment, but I'd love to come by and just have a chat with you guys. Let's build up some relationships so when the time comes for us to do some research together, my name, I know your name, we kind of know what we do. I've found out that I need to put remuneration into our budget for our research project so that people are adequately remunerated. Um, Antonio, from that kind of relational perspective and building good relationships with, clinicians, people with lived experience, what have you seen or experienced that has worked well?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is transparency. Um, around different parts of the project, the level of involvement. Don't overpromise, don't underpromise. You know,
Yeah,
um, I guess in particular as well, for people that aren't necessarily always actively involved in research projects. So, let's say over a 5 year, let's say you've got a 5 year trial happening, which is quite a long trial, and I'll use that example specifically as a long trial. You may only need to meet with your steering committee or your consumer advisors, people lived experience specifically in this case, every quarter, or that's what you may plan for. Um, the biggest thing, I guess, with the relationship is, and I've said this to researchers, and it's something I sort of do sometimes myself, is that if I've got nothing to report, I'm sending an email saying, "Hey, look, I haven't forgot about you. I've got nothing to report." So it's that engagement of building relationships because they're like, "Oh, maybe they've forgotten about us, or what have you." So the experience of the person that you're bringing in to the team is really big as part of that relationship. Because if you want people to have a positive experience, and we see this, and I know that, I have spoken with people anecdotally about their experience of why they don't necessarily participate in research. Like, well, I didn't have a good time doing it, or I didn't find value in it, or what have you. So building that experience, and then I guess recognition as well. And Johnny, you mentioned remuneration, and that's something that um, you know we've done a bit of work at SRI, but that even just that recognition of if someone isn't to be remunerated, be transparent about that, but actually recognizing their contribution in your work, whether it's a slide at a conference saying blah blah blah, these are the people that were involved, and acknowledgement um, in a paper, potentially co-authorship if they've done enough to warrant co-authorship. So I think that recognition is really important. And I'm really big on that on people with spinal cord injuries, and it sort of goes into my side as a side interest as well. Is like there are people with spinal cord injuries need to build their resume in a way, and even they need to build their research resume to say, look, I've been involved in all these different projects, and then they bring that to the table as well. So I really think that practical level of building relationships over just engaging with them, actually engaging with them outside of what you stipulated, because they may be things in your lulls in your project for a long period of time. But like I said, just let them know, hey, look, nothing really is exciting happening here. But then that gives them the confidence that they may have thought of something because you've engaged with them. They may email you randomly or pick up the phone, what have you, to say, okay, look, I've had this idea. I know it's not our quarterly meeting, but I'm sharing it with you. So with you engaging with them, that gives them the confidence, hopefully, to then engage back the other way. That and I know we'll talk about later that power dynamics, but it sort of humanizes the researcher or the project lead to the people that they're engaging with. It's not an us and them thing.
Yeah, it's like almost that when you have um good relationships, say in any meeting or any kind of human group, if you've got that psychosocial safety, but a degree of accountability, then people feel okay to express their ideas and that they won't get um, shot down in flames or anything. Um, Before we kind of move on to some more practical takeaways, Heather, did you have anything to add to that, listening to Antonio?
The one thing I was thinking about as both of you were talking was um, our meaningful engagement committee at ICORD. And what the first strategic goal of the meaningful engagement committee at ICORD is to strengthen relationships and networks. And so we actually spend quite a bit of time trying to support researchers and community members, knowledge users to just spend time together, not to design a research project together, not to work on this grant that's due in 5 days, but instead
Right.
create these moments of connection and spending time. And I think sometimes for people, it's like, well, what's that first step? So for us here in the Okanagan, the communities that live here meet for coffee at a local spot every week. And we've arranged that 4 times a year, the researchers come to coffee and we pay for coffee. And my request is please don't come with an agenda. Please come to spend time and meet people and connect. And over time, you'll start to see these like moments of like, oh, this is of value and of meaning to you too. Okay, there's some connections here. Another thing we're working towards is sort of a volunteer and cheer type piece of thinking about, can you come out to the children's wheelchair basketball event and can you volunteer and can you meet people and spend some time? And it's not about your research program. It's about building good relationships with the communities that you say your research aims to serve. And we absolutely have goals around building capacity for engagement and doing research together. But that first goal is about bringing people together to find common interests and common values and to start at a good spot of relationship. I like kind of what you said too, Johnny, of like, that can't be ignored, that co-design starts with relationships. So how do you want to show up in those?
I love those approaches, Heather. They're fantastic. And yeah, just spending time together, having a coffee or seeing a wheelchair basketball game and just learning. Um, and I suppose that's, to play devil's advocate a little bit, people might be thinking, yeah, I'd love to do that, but I'm pressed for time as it is, or I don't know how to access those places. So um, there's so much that we haven't covered today, and personally, I know I could talk to you guys for another 3 or 4 hours about this sort of stuff, and we've talked about that before. Um, but I suppose just for people listening today, um, who have listened to some of this stuff and thought, yeah, that's really cool, but how do I kind of operationalize it, to use a research term, into my day-to-day life? So I'm just wondering, on reflection, to put you on the spot a little bit, guys, maybe if you were to give, say, researchers three just really simple takeaways from today to, build co-design or partnership-based research into their focus. So three takeaways for researchers. And then I think it's probably actually also important to, maybe if you could give three takeaways for people with a lived experience too, who might be listening and thinking, yeah, I want to get into research, but it intimidates me, or I'm not sure if I've got anything to legitimate to give. Um, Antonio, to put you on the spot there, what takeaways would you share with people?
Yeah. So the first part, I guess, for researchers, is to plan. We're talking about relationships and what have you, and it's important to have those. You can plan developing relationships, and that's more of a long-term strategy. But if we're talking about on an individual project, and I sort of touched on it before, so plan how you want to have your co-design. I think the biggest question I think about that is not spoken about enough, that researchers need to really ask themselves is, what do I actually want out of the people I'm engaging with? So it's like, well, I'm including them. That's great, but what do I want out of them? They may give you information that you've never thought of, but you should have some idea. As like, well, okay, I want them involved in methodology, relevance, governance, what have you. So actually think that through rather than, well, I'm getting people involved because I'm getting people involved. So actually try and think through. Now, that may not end, what you get out of them may not end up what you plan to get out of them, but at least you've thought about it in some sense. I guess the second takeaway of part of that planning is, really I go through the process within each project of clearly identifying who you get involved and actually working through that. So, a person with, and this is something that I've thought about a lot and looked at a lot. So yes, we want to get a person involved with lived experience, but actually the individual with lived experience has their own personality, their own knowledge, their own skill sets, and what have you. So, that relevance that they bring through their own life experience that is complemented with their lived experience, I think is really important. So actually identifying that. And then obviously the people implementing your work is part of that as well. And then the third part of that is, and it sort of goes to Heather's point before, what she was talking about, so self-reflection, and I know you're doing a bit of work looking at your principles on how IKT principles, how they apply this as well, is actually evaluate the process. And that's something that I think, and I know Johnny, you and I are working together on something in this space at the moment as well. It's actually evaluate during and after the project. It's like, well, what impact did the co-design have? Did I actually engage to a level that I got the most out of it? And if the answer is no, that's fine because it is learning. What were the barriers to engaging? What worked well? So it's that evaluation. Because I think a lot of time in co-design, and I know it is changing, that we evaluate the experience of the people that participated rather than the impact that the people that participated actually had on the project. So it's like
Right.
okay. So it's a bit like, yep, we evaluated, everyone enjoyed the process, they're happy to do it again. Okay, well, what did they do within the project? Oh, we're not sure, but they enjoy doing it. So I think both things need to be true, that the impact as well as the value and the enjoyment. Tips for lived experience. That's an interesting one. Um, I often say to people, and it's this sort of, I haven't done peer support for a long period of time, but it's sort of something that I used in peer support. So I'm now, 6 years at the SRI? So 6 years in research, let's say. 6 years was 2 weeks once. And this is the thing. So just get involved. Like if you don't get
Yeah.
involved, you don't give yourself the opportunity to become a Johnny Bourke or what have you. So that's that first step. Because and it's the same in peer support. I remember, and even now, if I ever do speak with someone, it's like, oh, you've had your spinal injury for over 20 years, but 20 years was 2 weeks once. I'm really big on that.
Great advice. Yeah.
So I think the other thing is as well, don't overthink your role in a project because, really you're there to um, you're there to give advice and not necessarily be a researcher. If you want to go off and be a researcher, great, be great springboard. But so that's I don't necessarily overthink it. But I guess the last thing as well is it may open your career up to other things. And I'm really big on that. It's like, you may become a researcher, you can build stuff on your resume. You actually, you know, and I guess the big thing that we've sort of spoken about is really the relationships. You will build relationships like, we're all here on as colleagues today, but as you said, Johnny, we can talk about things for hours between the three of us. And part of that is because we have good relationships, even though, we're professionals and working what we do. But us three, as well as others, are an example of that, how we've, at one stage, us three didn't all know each other, but now we do, and we're working in the same space moving forward. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a lot of that, Johnny.
No, good as gold, Antonio. There was some absolute gold in there for sure. Um, yeah, I kind of want to speak to a lot of that, but I'm going to throw over to Heather to see. So takeaways for researchers and people with lived experience, Heather.
It's such a good question, Johnny. And
Should have
much
based
like
the whole
Antonio,
podcast around that.
yeah, it's like what do we do? I think for the researchers, there's kind of multiple pieces to this, right? So there's the piece for the researcher that you do need to know a bit about co-design and you need to build your skills in it. So I kind of think about that like you need to know how to swim, right? So actually building your skills in co-design. Start
Yeah,
early, go and look at either the guiding principles or other work talking about co-design. Really think about what are the skills I want to have to be able to do this well. You might want to get a mentor or somebody that can help you with that in the same way if you wanted to learn how to swim. But the other thing for researchers that I think for them to acknowledge and maybe think about is that, yes, much like swimming, co-design is hard. And the water that you're swimming in, essentially the research system, hasn't actually been often designed for co-design. So our funding bodies, our institutions, the way we think about merit and in Canada, the tenure process, what we value often is that publication over application and maybe publication over a relationship. And so making that fundamental shift of, yes, this will take time, but why are we here? What we actually want to do relevant and impactful work. And so I also look at my role as a researcher in this space to think about how do I calm that water so that when you do decide to swim, it's quite a bit easier for you to do it. But for an individual researcher right now who will be put in many different types of waters, I would say always swim with a partner, just like the
yeah,
classic safety pieces. and start to learn, take some lessons. NASCIC has pieces around how to learn about partnered research, coming to this podcast. So spending some time and then really maybe coming back to those pieces of starting early in your process. Don't be asking anyone 2 to 3 days before the grant is due to sign off on something they've never read, and really thinking about how they are sharing in decision making. And then if I flip that for knowledge users and all of the partners that maybe don't necessarily call themselves a researcher, even though they end up being a researcher in our processes, I think the big thing to highlight is that not all expertise comes with a PhD, and you do not have to have a PhD to be involved in a research project. You don't even necessarily have to have research experience. Your lived experience is expertise. Whether you are a person with SCI, or you are a clinician who's worked with people with SCI, or you're a family member, you have expertise to particular projects, and that needs to be valued. When interacting with a researcher that might be interested in partnering with you, in the same way as if you're starting any other relationship, get to know their values, understand how they work, their roles, their expectations, compensation. It's acceptable and absolutely necessary that you ask about those things, so that you are treated with dignity and respect. And then if you don't see those things, it is okay for you to say that you do not want to be part of that person's partnership. And there are so many other opportunities and wonderful people you can work with. And with that, having a mentor as well, asking that person, how do I get involved in other projects? How could I meet a researcher interested in X? Thinking about some of those things, I think, is really important.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think just to add my 2 cents, pretty much you guys have summed up all the things that I was hoping to say as well. My takeaways for people with lived experience is always to remember that it's your experience that is the expertise. It's your experience on the day to day, whether it's getting up in the morning, dealing with health issues, dealing with accessibility issues, dealing with clinical services. That's legitimate, valid knowledge, and that's what contributes to a research project, and you need to kind of stand behind that and be proud. Excuse the terrible pun there. Um, and if you're someone with the lived experience, ask about roles, ask about remuneration, ask about time. What's research asking you to do? Don't be backwards and coming forwards for that stuff. And just like you said, Heather, it's okay to say no. We know there are power dynamics between researchers and people with the lived experience of spinal cord injury. So if someone's coming to ask you and you feel pressured to join a project, just say no, that's fine. We're in the we're in the kind of consent's a big thing these days in all parts of life, and it applies to research as well. For researchers, just like you've both said in the last 10 minutes, start early and build relationships. It's not always easy. It's not always built into funding, grants, or the research culture, but just do your best. Make sure you remunerate people. That's just a fundamental. And designed for access too, not convenience. So can people digest information that you're trying to communicate with your research and things like that? But look, I think we might start to wrap things up because, like we say, we could chat for hours and hours, but I think we've been going for about an hour already. So look, I'd just love to thank you so much, Associate Professor Heather Gainforth from the University of British Columbia. Your dedication to the field and your work in the field is something to hold in such high regard. And as a person with a lived experience and a researcher myself, I congratulate all the work you're doing and look forward to working with you in the future. Um, Same goes for you, Antonio Vecchio from the Spinal Research Institute in Melbourne, Australia. So much of what you bring to the whole um, the culture and the industry of what we do is so valuable. So I'd just like to thank you on behalf of myself and the International Spinal Cord Injury Society. Any last takeaways you can fit into 10 seconds each?
Well, thank you for the kind words, Johnny. That means so much coming from you. And I think at the heart of it is relationships matter and people matter. And research is done by people for people. So coming back to that at the heart of what we do.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I guess for me, very quickly, Johnny, what you do is amazing. When we talk about mentors, two people I learn a lot off is two people on this call. Johnny, yourself with your lived experience and researcher, and Heather, I know, some of the chats you and I have had, not being from this space, that's you've both mentored me in a lot of ways. So I think that value, and then hopefully I in turn pass that on to others as well. So I think that's just an example of that knowledge sharing through people. So thank you.
No worries. Oh well, we'll end it there. So hopefully people got something out of that. Um, Hopefully all three of us will be at the ISCOS conference in Kuala Lumpur in 2026. So if you see us in the hallways or any of the rooms, please don't be shy and coming forward to have a chat with us or ask us advice. So I'll say goodbye to everyone listening now and look forward to working with Heather and Tony in the future. Thanks very much.